All right, guys, here we have today's edition of Nintendeen Today, in which he explains to us how 007 First Light is the greatest thing ever and how it's never, ever, ever going to be good on Nintendo Switch 2.
Seemingly, the benchmark is that Xbox Series S. Now, obviously, in the PC space, you can go a little bit weaker than the Xbox Series S, actually a lot weaker in the case of the Steam Deck, is running it at 30 frames per second. But in the PC space, there's also a lot more tinkering and tampering involved to get things to comfortably run where you would like, which obviously doesn't really exist, at least to the same extent, in the console space. So if you're thinking about it from a console perspective, if you assume that the game was basically designed around like the base PS5 and the Series X, given a performance boost for the PS5 Pro, with a floor of around the Series S, it does make somebody wonder why the Nintendo Switch 2 is not in the conversation. You see, this game was actually a pretty big announcement for the Nintendo Switch 2, along with things like Elden Ring that had gotten delayed and Borderlands 4 that basically got cancelled. 007 joins a long lineup of games that are reportedly coming to the Nintendo Switch 2 until there's a realization that they probably either need to be delayed indefinitely, canceled altogether, or just they need more effort to make it work on this console.
Absolutely not. What's actually happening is that Sony stepped in and we're just like, you can't release this on Switch 2 day and date because it's going to make us look bad and it's going to mog us. And so, like, IO had to push the release date back a couple of months. It's no big deal. I love especially how he cites Borderlands 4 as an example of a game that's never, ever going to run on Switch 2 when anyone who knows anything about that game can tell you it doesn't run well on anything.
And I think this whole conversation has confused quite a few people. See, there's a common misconception of misinformation floating around the internet that the Nintendo Switch 2 can trade blows with the Xbox Series S, which is blatantly not true.
It's not true in the sense that the Switch 2 is actually better than the Xbox Series X, the PlayStation 5 Pro, and the highest-end gaming PCs. But yeah, go ahead. Keep coping, Nintendeen. Keep trying to gaslight people into thinking the Xbox Series S is somehow more relevant than the Nintendo Switch 2.
Not from a performance angle anyway. The Nintendo Switch 2, seeing as it's a console that came out 5 years after the Xbox Series S, is equipped with a more modern upscaling technology. To put it in the simplest terms that I can explain because I'm actually kind of still ignorant on a lot of the subject, every game on every piece of hardware that you have runs at a native resolution, whether that's 720p, 1080p, 360p, 540p, the higher the better. Thinking back to the Nintendo Switch, your handheld resolution was typically a maximum of 720p, but that didn't mean that every single game ran at 720p. In the case of the Switch 2, the handheld resolution is 1080p maximum, and the docked resolution goes up to 4K. But again, that doesn't mean that the games are actually running natively at those resolutions. Instead, the way that games are designed these days is that they have a native resolution, and then the upscaling is basically some wizardry magic, usually involving some form of AI, that makes it look like it's actually a higher resolution than what you are playing at. So for all intents and purposes, when it's coming to the visuals, you don't really care what the native resolution is. At least, that's what the conversation is online. That's what people tell you when they try to defend the Nintendo Switch 2. As far as you, the gamer, is concerned, if you're playing a docked version of Resident Evil Requiem on the Nintendo Switch 2, it's upscaled to 1080p. So you're playing a game that's 1080p. But the internal resolution, what it's actually rendering at, is 540p. The reason it doesn't render at 1080p is because if it actually rendered at 1080p, the frame rate would drop down dramatically. So basically, in order to get 30 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch 2 for Resident Evil Requiem, you would have to drop down to 540p. But they can make the 540p look like 1080p. In comparison, the Xbox Series S, the internal resolution is 720p, which is obviously a step higher than the Switch 2. While the Xbox Series S is running at 720p, it's upscaled to 1080p, so for the visuals for the guys that are playing on Xbox, and for the Nintendo Switch 2, both of them effectively are seeing 1080p. In the case of Series S, it also jumps up to 1440p depending on your display output, But we'll just keep it simple and say that they're both seeing 1080p visuals. But the difference is on the Xbox Series S, while it's natively running at 720p, it's able to hit 60 frames per second. So the Series S is natively running at a higher resolution than the Nintendo Switch 2, and it's getting double the frame rate. But if the Series S had to drop down any more than 720p for the native resolution, because its upscaler is outdated, it likely would not be able to still hit 1080p while upscaled in order to get that 60 frames per second. I know that might sound a little bit confusing, but basically the idea is that the lower you run the native resolution, the higher you can make the frame rate for the game that you're playing, and the newer the hardware you're using, the better it is that you can leapfrog those frame rates upwards and upscale them so that they look even nicer from a much lower resolution. But your frame rate is pretty much always going to be married to the native resolution. I think I mentioned this a few videos ago on my channel, but the idea is that for the Nintendo Switch 2, already in year one, it has games that are releasing at around 360p to 540p for the native resolution. And with the native resolution being that low, with the output still being an unstable 30 frames per second in a lot of games, especially considering a lot of these games are actually older games, like they released last year, the year before, in some cases even 5 years ago, if the Switch 2 already has to use such a low native resolution to run those games just to get a 30 frames per second frame rate, then as these games advance and technology advances, and the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One get left behind, it's going to be a lot harder to expect certain games to be able to run on the Nintendo Switch 2 going forward in this console generation.
Did this retard really just imply that 007 First Light is launching on PS4 and Xbox One? Because I went ahead and double checked, and no, it's not. Like, this is a next-gen game that is getting a Switch 2 version after we've gotten a lot of PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X ports already. You know, we got Indiana Jones in May, we got Street Fighter 6, we've gotten a lot of games that aren't available on the PS4 and the Xbox One. Like, he's talking as if the PS4 and the Xbox One haven't been phased out at this point. Like, it's true that we still get like a number of like lower budget games releasing both on like the PS4 and the PS5. But when it comes to like the more demanding games like this, like we have seen the last console generation getting left behind a long time ago. He's negatively comparing the Nintendo Switch to the Xbox Series S, and then he's like turning around and trying to say like, "Oh man, just wait until the PS4 and the Xbox One are over. Then the Switch 2 is going to be in trouble." And it's just like, what are you talking about? Like, it's going to be another 2 years until like the Xbox and PlayStation consoles hit store shelves. You know, by that point, the Switch 2 will be in full swing. And then in another, like, you know, few years, we'll get the Switch 3. And that'll be able to run all the games that have come out in the very small, narrow window in which these overpriced, overpowered pieces of hardware hit the market and just flop. Like, the simple reality is the gap between the power scaling of these consoles is so minimal at this stage that we can't reasonably expect major AAA games to suffer performance on Switch 2. We've seen this already with Resident Evil Requiem. We've seen this already with Pragmata. We already have dozens of examples of games that were originally intended for PS5 making it over to the Switch day and date with no issues. The situation that he's describing, that like 007 was delayed, that is very much an anomaly. We have not seen a lot of this kind of thing this console generation. Borderlands 4 did it, but Borderlands 4 was a mess in general, and I imagine this is as well. Like, the simple fact of the matter is that Switch 2 is in a very, 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 very good position third-party wise right now, but this is something that's a huge threat to Nintendeen's narrative, and he's going to do everything he possibly can to downplay reality.
Sure, you will still have some exceptions, mostly from some of the wealthiest and largest Japanese studios like Capcom, for example, but in many cases it would actually be unfair to assume that the studios that are already trying to deliver a good game for the modern console generation, it would be unfair to even assume that they have the resources in order to spit these games out for the Nintendo Switch 2 with the amount of time and amount of things that they have to water down in those games in order to get them out to the public. This is why you'll hear someone like Capcom talk about how easy it was for them to scale things back for releasing a game on the Switch 2, and then meanwhile you'll hear other publishers talk about the hell that they went to and the amount of effort that they had to put in order to get their game to run on the Switch 2.
What you're actually seeing there is developers being honest, acknowledging how easy it is to port a video game to another video game platform versus publishers who are being dishonest and trying to make excuses as to why they aren't supporting Nintendo consoles when it always just comes down to like backroom deals with Sony. Okay. Like, again, we have way too many indications at this point that the reason 007 First Light was delayed had nothing to do with performance. It had nothing to do with like resource management. It had nothing to do with like, the game's target demographic or the Switch 2. It was entirely because IO Interactive wanted to push the PlayStation version first. That's the only reason.
The bigger the studio, the higher the priority it is to try to get to that market, the more likely they are to be willing to put in that effort. But the thing is that time and effort is money. It's money that they have to put into it in order to get the game to run on the Switch 2. And, based off of the last financial that we saw from the Nintendo Switch 2, based off the software that's been sold, there's significantly fewer third-party games that are being purchased, less than one per console.
Yeah, this is very observably not true by simply looking at the bestsellers page or looking at store shelves. Like, third-party games are selling perfectly fine on Switch 2. So, Nintendeen is just straight up lying. He is perpetrating this myth, this idea that third-party games are underperforming on the console when we have dozens of examples of that not being the case. Indiana Jones is doing fairly well. Pragmata did fairly well. I believe Monster Hunter Stories 3 did reasonably well. We've had Tales of Arise, I think, has done fairly well. There's lots of these third-party releases that have come out on the console that have done, real numbers. Resident Evil Requiem did well. The entire narrative that third-party games don't sell on on Switch 2, it's a complete farce and really needs to get called out for what it is. There is nothing to indicate that.
So every single person that's bought a Switch 2, there's an attachment rate of less than one person buying anything other than a first-party game per console. That includes all of the indie games, that includes all of the third-party titles. So if you're somebody that bought the Switch 2 version of Hades, for example, statistically speaking, that's the only non-first-party game that you've purchased, and your two friends that are sitting next to you, again, statistically speaking, may have not even purchased a single third-party game on the Switch 2. So it should come as a surprise to absolutely nobody that so many of these games are facing some form of development hell when it comes out to the console. Sure, you can make it work. You can always put in a lot of effort to make it work. But the question is whether or not it's worth it. For someone like Capcom, who has the time and the resources and the manpower to make something like that work, they might find it to be worth it. But other developers definitely might feel like it's better to put that game on the back burner so they can focus more of their effort on the actual modern day higher end stuff.
Switch 2 is actually more of a modern console than the Xbox Series X because, it's brand new. What is he talking about? What is he talking about? The developers would rather make games on the real hardware. Bro, it's 2026. You have to move past this notion. PlayStation and Xbox aren't doing anything that Nintendo Switch can't do better. And that's just a very observable thing in this day and age. Is that what exactly is coming out on those platforms that isn't coming out on Switch 2? The simple fact of the matter is pretty much nothing. Unless Sony has a straight up deal to prevent games from releasing on Nintendo consoles, they're going to come out because they are selling extraordinarily well.
If the Xbox Series S is only able to run the game at a 30 frames per second, and that gives you an output of around 1080p visuals, well, hypothetically speaking, how much more can you possibly water it down in order to get it to run on the Switch 2 at 30 frames per second? Right, because that's what they're doing in the other games. The Xbox Series S version runs at 60 frames per second, they want to make the Switch 2 version look nice, So they go to 30 frames per second, and then the Switch 2 version looks presentable, along with a few other edits and removal of textures and whatnot. But if the lowest base modern day console is already at 30 frames per second, it's not like you can release the game for the Switch 2 at 20 frames per second or 15 frames per second. So naturally, they have to do a lot more washing on the Nintendo Switch 2 version even to get it to sit at that 30 frames per second mark. It's very similar to the types of issues that the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One have had during the last 5 years. And it's part of the reason many people believe that those consoles were holding back the generation. They would also say that the Series S is holding back the generation, but I think the fact that the games were still being released on the last gen console was holding them back even more. We know what the ceiling is on many of these titles, but that ceiling gets higher if the floor is also higher. So if resources are going towards making sure these games are at least playable on the lower end stuff, that's time that could be spent optimizing them for the higher end stuff.
Oh, great, this cope again. Because the Nintendo version exists, it's holding back game development. Like the
No.
idea that last
No.
generation
That's not how
versions
this
of
works.
games existing is somehow holding back game development is just laughable, because these games are in production for several years at this stage. I don't know how long First Light was in development, but when you compare it to something like, The Elder Scrolls 6, which is going to take like 20 years to produce, or Grand Theft Auto 6, which took like 13, or like you look at like Starfield, I think took a decade. Like I imagine, reasonably speaking, 007 First Light was in production for like at least 6 to 8 years. Okay. Like 6 to 8 years to develop this game, make it as technically impressive as possible, push boundaries. They were deciding on the tone, the writing, the visuals. Um, the hardware doesn't matter as much as it used to. I do think that's the reality of what people like Nintendeen need to understand, is that it's perfectly it's perfectly reasonable to assume that games like this are made with the intention of releasing on more powerful hardware down the line for re-releases or for the likes. So they're not necessarily trying to push the current hardware to the limit. Like what they want to do is make it as appealing as possible, and like keep the budget down, and like make the game, like make sure it actually sells. The idea that a weak console would hold back at game dev, or like hold back like the vision for the game, it's just completely ridiculous. It's just out of touch with the way these games are made now and how long they take to produce. Nintendo acknowledged himself how the Xbox Series X is still gets a version of this game, right? In spite of not being as powerful as the Series X. That's a very good example of what I'm talking about. Third-party developers are going to want to prioritize producing, making sure the game is playable in on as many modern pieces of hardware as possible, whether that's Xbox, PlayStation, PC, or like, any variant thereof. Like, it doesn't really make any sense for them to develop a game that could run that's running on hardware so advanced that people don't own it yet, or it hasn't been produced yet, or it won't be commercially available or like viable. Like it makes sense for them to keep their audience and their general demographic in mind. The reason that we're seeing so many Nintendo Switch 2 versions of games now is because they are selling, they are doing well, they do have a reasonably sized audience, and publishers are realizing that there is an audience there that will buy their games. So they are indeed making the slow transition to putting these kinds of games on Nintendo consoles as well. The stigma that consoles are somehow holding back game dev doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when you really take that into consideration. Like obviously game developers want to produce games on consoles that people will actually buy them on. This is why absolutely no one produces games primarily for PC. They could technically produce the most technically demanding game imaginable that like pushes like modern PC hardware to its limits, but it would be too expensive. It would be outdated within a couple of years, and nobody would buy it. People would just wait for consoles to catch up. Like the simple fact of the matter is, it doesn't make that much sense to be this obsessed with the technical performance of games.
And I'm not saying that these games need to run on a $5,000 rig, but even the baseline of the Xbox Series console or the PlayStation 5 will look better if there's less focus on the smaller end stuff, and that's what we're seeing here. When the PlayStation 5 gets a game that requires performance mode to hit 60 frames per second, then you know they're fully pushing things to the limits. Now obviously in some cases it means that the game is just poorly optimized, but in the case of IO Interactive's 007 title, based off of all of the reviews and analyses, that's simply not the case. They've actually done an excellent job optimizing this for everybody that can grab it. And quite frankly, it would be a shame to see this game lower in quality because they had to spend more time optimizing it for the Switch 2. You don't want them to spread themselves too thin. And if you remember just a few months ago when they were showing footage in one of the presentations that happened last year, we saw stutters, even in the gameplay that they were displaying to everybody. So it's clear that this was a pretty ambitious title. And if it was struggling on the hardware that is the target audience effectively, how much worse do you think it's going to struggle on something like the Switch 2?
I love his fanfiction alternate reality as if like PlayStation is automatically the primary audience for this kind of game. It just doesn't make any sense. Do you know what console the most iconic 007 game ever launched on? GoldenEye for the N64, right? The idea that like the audience can't shift or they can't, play this on Switch 2 or that the Switch 2 will never outperform the PlayStation. It's a dated concept that I do think is going to have to get addressed, because I do think this is going to be the first console generation ever in which we start to consistently see Nintendo Switch 2 outperforming PlayStation when it comes to third-party releases. I already feel like indie games do way better on Switch than they do most other platforms, but right now we're in this weird cope phase where people are acting like, well, 007 released first on PlayStation and the Switch 2 version didn't do as well. Like, they had to sabotage it to make that happen. Like, if they have to straight up sabotage the Switch 2 version to get what they want, just how scared they are of just how well the Switch 2 version is going to do.
It actually makes full sense to me as to why the Nintendo Switch 2 would be delayed. And in a weird sense, it actually made me want the game more. Not because I dislike the Nintendo Switch 2 having games. I actually wouldn't even care if a game got released on the PlayStation 4. But I do have a fairly high-end desktop, and for the most part, I don't want to buy games brand new at full price because, well, I don't feel like they're really testing the hardware. I'd rather just pick up any game that's released in the last 5 years and give that a go. Any of the ones that I skipped. I've spent a lot of time on Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor recently. I've even played through Hogwarts Legacy now, and I've paid around $10 for each of those games maximum. So I've just felt like it hasn't been worth my time to effectively play these games that could also run on lower end hardware and pay $70 for them. But when a game like this comes out and they're talking about how great they've done at optimizing it for every single devices, I know that it's running such a good engine because they cannot simply put it on the last gen or the inferior hardware, like the Switch 2, for example.
But it is releasing on inferior hardware. The Xbox Series X and I suppose the base PS5. The Xbox Series S and the base PS5 are indeed weaker than the Pro and the X models specifically. So basically what Nintendeen is saying here is that the Switch 2 is weaker than those, that it can't possibly run this game, that doesn't seem to be all that demanding and doesn't seem to be like outside the realm of the Switch 2's capabilities, that's already gotten like confirmation that it's coming out. Like, he's really going to say this. Like, he's really going to say that 007 First Light is like going to be the Switch 2 version is going to be the worst version of the game.
I felt the same way when Crimson Desert came out, except the difference is the early reviews of Crimson Desert mostly recommended to wait until there are some patches and fixes. And that's a very big reason why I never jumped into that game yet. Honestly, I wanted to test out my PC. I wanted to see how good a game runs on here that can't run on last gen stuff, like the Switch 2. Well, power-wise for the Switch 2 anyway. Now, spoiler alert for the next segment forward, because the background footage that you're going to see now is the opening segments of the game. I've played about an hour and a half of the game so far. I'm not here to review an entire game just based off of the minor bit of experience that I've had, but I will say that it did really suck me in. It is an amazing opening to this title, and I can already tell that I'm going to be enjoying it all the way through to the end. But I did want to record some of this stuff since I am running a 5070 graphics card and a 9900X CPU, so effectively I've been able to maximize the settings just to play this thing at 60 frames per second. And it is gorgeous. I actually also ended up playing this on the Legion Go just because I wanted to try it out, and we'll show that later on in this video. But this is very clearly a current gen title, and it's something that it's very clear that they put a lot of time and effort into just to make it run as good as possible on the highest end stuff while still looking like it justifies that high-end hardware. You know, like sometimes I'll see somebody playing a game on a PlayStation 5 Pro and I'm like, it looks good, but was it really necessary to play this on a PS5 Pro? Especially because these games came out, 3 or 4 years ago. But a game like 007, no, absolutely. If you have a PlayStation 5 Pro and you're playing it on there, I do think it is genuinely a better experience to play it on the highest end machine that you have. A Series X on a PlayStation 5 is absolutely more than acceptable and even a very good experience, but anything weaker than that, you're looking at what I would argue is not really the same type of experience. It's not bad, and I understand that not everybody can shell out whatever was it, $600 now for a base PS5, or shoot even more than that for a high-end gaming PC or even a higher-end handheld, so it is nice that these games are watered down to an extent for those people to enjoy them, but I would argue there is still a very noticeable difference when you're jumping from the higher-end stuff to the lower-tier stuff. And very important, my low tier here is the Xbox Series S, so even the Steam Deck I would say is a little bit too weak for this one. And whenever that Switch 2 version comes out, if they decide to release it on there, I have no doubt in my mind that if you actually play through the two different versions together, you would notice an immense drop-off. And a very big reason as to why I say this is because I did play it on my Legion Go. Now, the way that I game these days is actually mostly on my Legion Go. I have my desktop, it's connected to a 4K monitor, it's also connected to a TV that's right next to it. I typically don't like playing games on my desk unless I'm recording footage. Normally I like to lay on the couch and play off of the TV. But even more than that, I often like to play my Legion Go outside on the deck, on the couch in the living room while I'm watching sports, or even maybe in bed before I knock out. So even though objectively one of the worst way to experience most of the games that I buy is on my Legion Go, I still find that I more often than not rather play it on the Legion Go just for that comfort. I mean, look, it's a handheld gaming device. You don't need me to explain to you all the benefits of that.
This coming from the Nintendeen of all people, who has been rallying against the Switch 2 and rallying against Nintendo, it's laughable. Like it's just straight up retarded. So wait, is he telling me that he owns a Legion Go and a Steam Deck? Like, so he owns everything under the sun other than a Switch 2. Is that what I'm supposed to believe?
Even if these things aren't all that portable, it's still nice to be able to play them any room in the house. Now, every single game that I've played prior to 007, I have noticed a drop-off when going from the desktop to the Legion Go. Especially with something like Jedi Survivor, which came out in 2023. But even with Jedi Survivor, it hasn't dropped off to the point where I feel like I'm getting really that much lesser of an experience by playing it on the Legion Go. But it does get pretty close to that feeling where I'm like, I don't know if this is worth playing on this device. But right now, when I'm trying out 007, my immediate thought once I did shift over to the Legion Go, again, I did that just to grab the footage for this video, it was nice to see how well it was running on there, even at 60 frames per second through most of it when I was keeping the resolution low and upscaling. But even though it was running much better than I expected that it would on the Legion Go, immediately my thought was, after we're done getting footage for this, I'm playing this game either on my TV or at my desk. Now keep in mind the footage that you're seeing here from the Legion Go is blown up. It was actually on a much smaller screen, so it probably looks a lot worse with what you're seeing right now. And because I was tampering quite a bit through the settings every few minutes. Mostly just experimenting, to be honest. Typically when I do decide to play these games on my Legion Go, I always go down to the lowest resolution and then I upscale it because I like to hit as close as possible to that 144 frames per second, and I also prioritize the longer battery life without having the fan up on full blast. But in this case, I did want to test it out to see how it would run. Obviously, when I was running it at a higher resolution natively, it was getting very choppy, down to like 15 frames per second at some points. But surprisingly, I had it set to the maximum frame rate of 144 frames per second. I upscaled everything, put it down to 800p for the lowest resolution, game, and I still put all of the detailed settings up to the highest point. I put them on the ultra setting for the most part, and I was still hovering at a pretty high and pretty comfortable frame rate. It looked good, but more importantly, it felt very good. And typically, I'm not running a screen recorder on top of this thing, which I'm pretty sure is actually ruining the footage that you're seeing right now. So I actually have no doubt that with spending probably less than 10 minutes, I can make this game look phenomenal for me, even in handheld mode. But despite that, I have zero interest in playing this game on my Legion Go, and I don't think I'm going to. And it will be the first game that I actively go out of my way to effectively only play it on my desktop instead of the Legion Go. And now this is not the Legion Go 2, this is not even the Legion Go S, this is the Legion Go, the original one with the Z1 Extreme chip. The only modification I've done on here is I bought the Legion Go 2 controllers because they were on a special for like 80 bucks, so I upgraded that. But otherwise, it's the OG system. It came out in 2023. It's strong enough for most games that I'll ever need to play. The game is optimized very well on here, everything's running perfectly. This is objectively a stronger handheld than the Nintendo Switch 2 and most other handheld gaming PCs that many other people will be playing on, and despite that, I still think it's not worth it for me to play on this device.
All that money spent, all that effort, all that chilling, and he still can't play this game on a Legion Go. Oh, that's so sad. That's so sad, Nintendeen. Ugh. But this is exactly the reason why I don't want to hear about like graphics faggotry, why I don't want to hear about frame rates, why I don't want to hear about like the resolution, because it really does just detract from like the actual experience of, actually playing the game. Here he is making this video, trying to attack the Switch 2 because of this game, and yet he's played like an hour and a half of it. He's bitching about the Legion Go. He's going to play the rest of it on his desktop. And I'm just like, who cares? Like that's my mindset, like watching this video. That's my mindset of hearing him yap about this, is that like, who the fuck cares? You didn't need to like go through this process to realize that the Legion Go was a piece of shit. Okay? Like nobody buys or plays games on these pieces of hardware.
I believe it is too much of a lesser experience. I can only imagine how much worse it's going to be on the Switch 2. Now, mind you, I don't think every game should just leave the weaker hardware behind. In fact, I wish every single game would be available on every device that people own. Heck, I'm still very much a strong believer that Nintendo should port back their weaker Switch 2 games for the Switch 1. Something that, ironically, most Switch 2 fans that would have an issue with this video would argue against that happening for the Switch 2 to the Switch 1. So I'm not saying that you should not buy the game if all you have is a Switch 2, or all you have is a Steam Deck, or even a Series S. I'm just saying that if you have anything else, it's going to be a better experience on there. And I think it's a much noticeably different experience, to the point where it's not worth it to play on the inferior stuff if you're able to access the stronger stuff.
Except in when, you want to play the game in handheld mode. This is what Nintendeen doesn't realize, is that like, oh man, I've beta tested this game on like 6 different platforms, and I like this one more, so I'm going to stick with it. Like, normal people are just going to buy the Switch 2 version, and they're going to be happy with that. It's going to look great in handheld mode. It's going to look great in docked mode. It's going to be a fantastic experience for Nintendo owners, no matter what. People aren't going to go through this like huge song and dance where they're just like, oh man, I bought the Nintendo Switch 2 version, but I wish I bought the real version on the PS5 Pro. Like, nobody is going to be doing that. Nobody.
And that's something that's not always the case with the titles that are available on multiple devices. In fact, like I said, this is the very first game that I've purchased where I feel like it is not even worth thinking about playing it on something other than the strongest piece of hardware that I own. And I would be foolish if I argued that my Legion Go experience could be comparable to what I was playing on my desktop. Basically, I think this is a very good game, and I think it's a very good modern-gen title, and the best way to experience those is on the highest-end hardware. And the reality is, the floor for this game, at least right now, until they start to water it down even more and make it even less of an experience, the floor of this title in the console space is the Xbox Series S, a device that is clearly much stronger and much better at performance than the Switch 2, despite what many people out there would have you believe. And the gap is only going to become clearer as the generation moves on. Even if the Nintendo Switch 2 can get some games to look better than the Series S, if the Series S is only able to run a game at 30 frames per second, it's going to take significantly more work and more upscaling and a lot more effort and time and money in order to get that game to run at 30 frames per second on the Switch 2. And as this generation moves forward, I think there are going to be a lot more Xbox Series S games that do not pass by that 30 frames per second marker, which means that the Switch 2, at least from a third-party angle, is going to face a lot more troubles just like this one, just like what we've seen over the last year. Especially if the attachment rate for third parties per console is still at less than 1 per person who buys a Switch 2. Anyway, that's all I got for right now. I'm gonna go play 007 for another 45 minutes and then go to sleep. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.
I love how he says as the generation goes on, as if we're not on the verge of the PS6 and the Xbox Series, the Xbox Helix coming out. So there isn't going to be some like mystical new Xbox like game that comes out that runs better on the Series S than it does on the Switch 2. Like it's just not going to happen. We're going to move on to the next console generation, which is going to flop. We're going to see the Xbox get phased out entirely, be a complete disaster, be a complete train wreck, and we're going to continue seeing like the continued decline of the PlayStation and Xbox brand. Like they are not going to be able to control the industry like they did in the 2000s. And that's going to be like more and more apparent, I think, with every console generation going forward, is that there just aren't going to be enough AAA games that aren't on Nintendo Switch 2 to justify this idea that like the Switch 2 can't keep up or can't compete. Like even now, Nintendeen can't really name any games that are coming out on PlayStation or Xbox that aren't coming out on Switch 2. We have confirmation Starfield's coming. We're getting like, we got Fallout 4. We got like, we're getting a lot of these games that like were previously thought to like just not be possible on Switch 2. So, what we're seeing now is just a slow, gradual decline of this decades-old cope. This idea that Nintendo simply can't run that. The idea that like the Switch 2 is so far behind power-wise that it can't possibly run a game like 007 First Light. And I think we're going to see firsthand over and over and over again that that's not the case. I'm Harman Smith. Thank you for watching.